Good afternoon. I'll start with a rather one-side lecture, an introduction, as you could say, from a high-level view about objectivity and a possible alternative for objectivity. And then I'll try to go into the practical issues that could be related if you choose to change a kind of ethics that is not based on objectivity but on something else. So the first part, it is preferred, I would prefer it in that you do not really pose questions during the first part, just write down what bothers you or what you are, what questions you have. And at the end of the lecture, then we have, I suppose we will have ample time to go into your questions. The lecture itself should take only about half an hour. So let's start with the lecture. Strange title to begin with, of course. Does God exist? Ethics for journalists in the network society. Whether or not God exists, frankly, I have no idea, and I couldn't care less. So, why am I asking that question then? Until recently, journalists were considered some kind of gods. In that sense, God not only existed, but he was manifold. That godlike status of journalists had nothing to do with the fact that journalism had such a big influence on society, which was also the case, but primarily with the fact that the journalist was supposed to be objective. In renowned broadcast institutions like the BBC or the VRT for that matter, objectivity was one of the mantras that was, and in a certain sense still is, really holy. What does this objectivity entail? Why was it so important in modern society, and why has this come under pressure in the so-called network society? In this talk, I will try to show what objectivity is a fata morgana that blocks the possibility of a real ethics in journalism, which is at the core of the profession, and which not only tolerates civil reporting and new media, but embraces it as a newfound reason of existence. Of course, objectivity has been implemented and put forward for good reasons. It is not something that came falling from the sky. It has to do with real concerns. To put these concerns in perspective, we have to go way back into history to see why this concept has gotten all this attention and even how it is related to the topic of this talk, namely ethics for journalists. You could consider Plato one of the first real authors using a kind of objectivity at the core of his writings. As you probably all know, Plato was a philosopher in ancient Greece who was a prolific writer and who wrote a bit like a journalist. He kind of registered the dialogues of his mentor Socrates with all kinds of people in Athens at the turn of the 5th to 4th century before Christ. So why did he do that? Why did he write down all those dialogues instead of just talking to the people as was normally the case in that time period? He had, in fact, two fundamental reasons to write these things down. The first one was the fight against relativism. The second, his resistance to the power of the masses. Both these fights are related to each other and are at the core of why he wrote and what he wrote. Let's consider the first aspect, the fight against relativism. As you probably all know, Athens at that time was a real democratic society, where it was very important to express yourself eloquently so that you can convince your peers of the things you thought were important. This, of course, meant that the formal art of rhetoric and discussion was very, very highly thought of, so high even that the content was often considered of less importance than the fact that you could argue well about it. So, at that time, there was an important class of people who were specialized in discussing and arguing. They were called the sophists. They're a bit comparable to our current day lawyers and politicians. Their skill had everything to do with convincing others of whatever truth they had to be convinced of. Values and truths were absolutely relative. Practically all of Plato's dialogues are dialogues where some sophist tries to convince an audience of some truth and Socrates intervening to demonstrate that the so-called truth that the sophist is defending or attacking is based on no real fundamentals, but that all these arguments are based on rumors and half-truths. The Socrates Plato stages in these dialogues is playing a role very comparable to that of a modern-day journalist. The comparison with the current state of affairs in Western democracies, with professional spokesmen, media-trained politicians, and slick lawyers trying to manipulate the Twittering, Facebooking, and Googling audience is astonishing. Never has there been a time as comparable with ancient Greece as now, except that we are, of course, with a lot of more people than in the time of Socrates. I really do believe that part of the image of Socrates, as portrayed by Plato, could be a nice role model for journalists in the network society. I return to this important topic at the end of this talk. There was, however, a completely different kind of Plato too. And it's that different Plato who had such a big influence on Western society until now, and who in part created the dogma or the fata morgana of objectivity. To counter the relativism of the sophists, where all values are relative and equally defensible, he proposed a world where nothing changes and where real truth, beauty and goodness resides on another side. That side was called the ideal world, or the world of forms. The world we live in is just a shadow of this real world. To reach this ideal world, you had to study the never-changing ideas and distance yourself from the so-called doxa. That is, the collection of mere superfluous knowledge and opinions. If you have such an image of reality like Plato has, it is clear that the task for the philosopher for Plato is to contemplate the eternal truths and not the ever-changing world governed by mere opinions. You have to pursue the real never-changing truth of the ideal world. This vision has had a tremendous influence on Western society, especially combined with the rise of Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where the eternal ideal world transformed into a God-controlled afterworld. Throughout Western history, the real truth was not found in this world, but in the divine one, and this was not really open for discussion. Real truth was revealed and had to be broadcast to as big an audience as possible. The first real post-Roman Empire Western journalists, delivering the news to as broad an audience as possible, were the priests, and they delivered the objective truth. News from other sources like artists and entertainers was considered to be the gutter press. They were condemned as relativists and sophists, or in the worst case, as heretics. Objectivity is that what the powers that be in that period, the church, tell you it is. There is but one truth, and this is the truth that has to be told. There was, however, another reason why Plato wrote his texts apart from his fight against relativism. That other reason, his fight against the opinion of the masses, was intimately related to the first reason and has had just as much influence on Western history and journalism as the first reason. As you probably know, Socrates was condemned to death by the Athenian public, because he was a so-called rioter and a polluter of the minds of the young Athenians. This was a democratic decision. A majority of people voted for his death. For Plato, this proved that democracy is worthless and that the common people are not capable to see the bigger picture and the things that are really important. As a person with diverging opinions from the majority, Plato does, you stand no chance to get your word across the masses just by talking. The only way to be heard is to write your thoughts down. To convince masses, you need to publish. So in that sense, you could consider Socrates the first real journalist and Plato his first publisher. The strange thing, however, is that Plato published to express a divergent opinion, executing an action we consider prominently democratic nowadays for the opposite reasons. It was directed against democracy because of the populist tendencies that are always in it and that make the system, at least according to Plato, unthoughtful. Plato is standing on its head here, fighting the exact thing he is doing himself, using democratic methods to fight against it. In a moment I show you how we can put him back on his feet. That internal tension has been something that also dominated the world of publication and press. The powers that be never have been at ease with publishing, but they also cannot do without. Never has this been proven better than with the invention of the printing press. The printing press's first task was to spread the word of God, and that it did. This automatically reduced the monopoly status of the priests and had the side effect of creating differing opinions. Reformation and the reaction to it were the effects that rippled through society in the Middle Ages, until it ultimately resulted in humanism and enlightenment. I'll come back to this when talking about the next important step in the transformation of the term objectivity and its importance for the modern press and society. The printing press also produced another side effect, the proliferation of the more mundane. Entertaining stories and pornography were two of the other more prominent products of the early printing press. When truth is monopolized by one party, the church, the deformed remnants of other truths and popular concerns pop up in all available media, not in the least in the new media of the time. It is in these new media that there were no clear rules yet. Here we find the core of what journalism should do: discover the hidden truths of all that is not in compliance with the governing truths and rules. It is by publishing the powerless and speechless that you can use Plato to turn Plato on his feet, so to say. This is all old news, you could say. What the hell have I as a journalist to do with Plato, religion, or history? Journalism is all about telling true stories about the world around us and informing the public of what is going on. No more, no less. I don't strive for eternal truths. I just try to describe matters of fact and analyze events happening around us, could a journalist think. A bit like a scientist, perhaps, not as someone who has a religious backing or who believes in never changing afterworlds or ideal worlds. Right you are, of course. But these statements have a strong history too, and they are rooted in that same objectivity story as before. In fact, it makes me think of Descartes' reaction to his environment. As you probably know, Descartes was a 17th century French philosopher, scientist and mathematician who strongly believed that he could tell truths about the world without having to rely on the truths given to him by religion. The problem of Descartes was not that all the people around him were relativists, like in Plato's time, but on the contrary, that they were dogmatists. There is only one truth, the divine truth. These dogmatists were also not supported through democratic processes, as in Athens, but by absolute monarchs. You could say that Descartes had completely different reasons to do what he did, but as we will see, came to conclusions that were very comparable to these of Plato. His problem was not that he could not be heard by the masses. He had to be very careful not to offend the wrong people, or he could very easily share the final destiny of Socrates. So, how can you build truth without relying on authority and without offending that same authority that loses some of its monopoly if you succeed? By telling a story, of course. Descartes starts by describing that there are a lot of mundane things that are doubtful. No religion could object to something like that. That's the basis of religion. He continues by saying that it is perhaps not enough to just doubt your senses or the things you experience. Suppose, he says, that there is some kind of an evil genius that tries to deceive us all the time. In such a case, we could even doubt the clear ideas of God, the world, and mathematics. He is, of course, very careful here to make it absolutely clear that this is just a thought experiment. But suppose that you accept such an evil genius, he goes on, even in such a case, there is one thing you cannot doubt, namely the fact that you are doubting, since when you are doubting, of course. This also automatically means that since you are doubting, you think, and therefore you exist. That is not a causal relation. It is not because you doubt or think that you are. It is just a fact by knowing that you think you have to be. Otherwise, there is no you, of course. In this way, Descartes reaches his first absolute certainty. I am. And what am I? I am a thinking being. Cogito ergo sum. This isn't enough, of course. You can't build science and mathematics solely on your own existence. So Descartes is looking for a way out of that solitude based on absolute doubt. He finds this way out in the most elegant manner he can use at that time. God is his savior in more than one way. And how does he make that ploy work? By using a language trick. A language trick that was well accepted within the framework of religious belief, the ontological proof of God. It would lead us too far to elaborate on this topic, but suffice it to say that once the existence of a positive God had been proven, Descartes had no difficulty to prove the rest of what are, for him, clear and distinct ideas. Science and mathematics were the logic building blocks whereupon he could build his knowledge tree without the further need of religious dogma, thus establishing a worldview rooted in absolute certainty, in which there is only one reality that has to be discovered, the objective reality explored by a thinking observer described as cogito. Thinking is fundamentally analyzing what is out there. And so, there you have it. A rock-solid, indubitable truth at the core of human thought. It's true, his fundamental distrust of the mix of knowledge and values, in his case, dogmatic religious values, that he reaches a basis for all knowledge, namely, the self. Science was very eager to build upon the Cartesian framework without ever thinking about that skeptical trap. The cost for building certainty and the unique reality, external reality, was the acceptance of a God they no longer believed in. How ironic is that? Although Descartes himself and his contemporaries had absolutely no problem to use God as an escape mechanism out of this existential pitfall, this trick also produced fundamental skepticism, giving rise to existentialism and nihilism at the same time. But again, what does all of this have to do with journalism? It should be clear by now that Plato as well as Descartes base all knowledge on an objective reality outside of themselves. They postulate a world that just is there, and that we just have to uncover to reach the truth. Plato has been used to build a religious worldview. Descartes is one of the fathers of a mathematical scientific worldview, and both worldviews have a fundamental distrust in values outside their own belief system. This same distrust in values other than factuality and compliance with the governing worldview determines the worldview of most scientists, even in the human sciences, and certainly also in journalism up till now. This is, of course, a major problem. By disavowing all values within your knowledge-producing institutions and organizations, you promote the only value at hand. The existing becomes its own ideology. The prominent German thinker Theodor Adorno called this phenomenon die totale Verblendungszusammenhang, something you could translate as the systemic blinding by the existing. With this construct, he hoped to show that all we think and do is determined and structured along the lines of that which is, which in turn is controlled by the ruling socio-economic and political powers. In that context, the media are nothing else than the self-awareness of the system. The use of something as objectivity, as a legitimation, is just an expression of what is fundamentally wrong in the media. Objectivity is the prolongation of the existing. For Adorno, there was only one way out of this misery: negative dialectics. The only thing we can do is to try and find the internal contradictions in the self-reproducing systems that surround us. You have to be totally and fundamentally critical, especially with everything that comes from media, press, and culture industry. This might have been good advice in Adorno's time, in the middle of the 20th century, with the prominence of Hollywood and broadcast media. But this is no longer the case. Something has changed since the turn of the century. The structure of communication is changing before our eyes. The hierarchical broadcast model, controlled by large industries, is coming under pressure by bottom-up organized media that all root in the distributed mother of all networks, the internet. The old media corporations, state-controlled or private alike, are trying desperately to regain the control they are threatened to lose through their own waning channels, as well as through legislative actions that try to curtail the newfound powers of the masses. That battle isn't over yet, but it will largely determine our future as human beings. Will we, as human beings, be able to use this new step in our evolution after having missed two opportunities with the rise of the written word and the rise of the printing press, to turn now ourselves towards a future that is less destructive and more diverse and harmonious? Or will we let the few in power determine the future of the many? This is the fundamental question for every human being, but most prominent, the basis for any ethics pertaining to journalists. So, we should not, as Adorno proposed, just try to show the internal conflicts in the system by using negative dialectics. No, this is no longer enough. The new media are giving us positive opportunities to not only show the conflicts in the existing, the holes in the objective, they show us also seeds of alternatives. By taking away fundamental hurdles for bottom-up initiatives to express themselves for all to see and read, we, and you journalists in particular, have the opportunity to show what values are governing not only at the surface, but also in the undercurrents of society. Of course, not everything has equal importance, and that is just why journalists are so important. Help determine what is valuable in the enormous stream of information on what is happening around us, with special attention for those initiatives that do not have the power or the means to use or control the big media. So we don't need negative dialectics for that, although this might also help. But you could call it dialectic perspectivism. Look at something from different angles, knowing that an objective world does not really exist. Everything is mediated in some way. Practicing the subtle art of what Heidegger called aletheia is what journalism should be. Showing things in the realization that showing something also means not showing something else. Knowing that shining a light on something automatically distorts it and produces shadows. Being very careful with what presents itself as important. Being critical and positive at the same time. So, a journalist is no god, nor is he a priest. He must be like a real scientist, not one of those positivists, but a scientist who knows he is rooted in society and who knows he is biased. A scientist knowing the importance of explicit values that guide his search. It's by understanding that you are in a dimly lit environment that you learn to walk in a never-shifting reality. That never is, but always is made. No one can pretend to know, but you have to assume it is worth trying. Replace objectivity with perspective and you get contemporary journalism. Sounds a bit like relativism, but it most certainly is not. There are values, and these are not relative, nor are they eternal. They are alive as we are. As I stated earlier, the image of Socrates is probably the best way you can describe the way a journalist should act. The ethics for journalists is a bit being Socrates. Know thyself. Know that you are not all-knowing. Distrust the well-spoken and powerful. Be prepared to risk your life to lay bare the lie or the deception. Don't hesitate to act upon your doubts, not your beliefs. With an ethical code like this, journalism and journalists have one of the most important tasks in our modern world. Helping us not to follow the smooth-talking, media-controlling powers that be, and helping us pick up and analyze the right messages in the never-ending communication stream from below. Not an easy task, but surely one worth pursuing as a career. We count on all of you to guide us through these transitional times. Thank you for listening. So this was a very high-level view of journalism, sometimes a bit far from your bed, I suppose. But I would like to try to go into the explicitly the last part of what I was talking about, the guiding principles that could guide a journalist in a way that he does no longer use objectivity as the core of his ideals, but something else, and what that could mean. But perhaps there are already questions about what I talked about here. I don't know. Are there already starting questions before I continue with the more practical stuff? Or was it too high above the heads?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I really like what you say. Showing something also means not showing something else, and highlighting something means putting shadows on something else. But what do you propose the alternative is? Because you can't write about every single thing, and that would be crazy objectivity. If I write a story about this, I have to write a story about that. What do you propose?
No, it's
What's
taking
realistic?
it's taking this aspect into account. So you have to make choices, but that's the next part, of course, is how do you do that? And there I will go into the separate aspects of all the elements that make out this practical ethics, you could say. One of the aspects is, what do I choose? What do I talk about? But if you choose something, it's important that you realize that by choosing it, you are neglecting something else. That's the first thing you could already answer to your question, I think.
But then if you look at what sells papers and what gets online hits, it's entertainment news and Kate Middleton's breasts.
Yeah. Doesn't fit ethics for journalists in my book.
Those choices are often made for you as a journalist because it's
yes.
the corporation you work for that. And the people who are clicking in now in our online society are making
in that sense, I would say you have the choice to do that or not. And that is one of the important aspects of an ethics. What do you want to do? what is guiding you, what is your task in life, you could say. Why do you choose journalism? Of course, if you want to be a writer, a writer of pseudo-fiction stories about the breasts of whomever, you can do that. But I would say you're not really a journalist as it should be, well, according to the ethics I'm describing here. Yeah, okay.
Do you really have the choice of choosing what to write? Because you can write as good as you want and it doesn't sell. No newspaper will.
Well, you have the choice to determine if you want to write things that sell. If you want to do that, you do that. That's no problem.
You have an income, you have to live.
Yeah, you have to live indeed. I have no problem with that.
Enough doesn't sell, no company will hire you.
But in that case, you're not a real journalist, you're a writer. You're a pseudo-fiction writer, I would say.
Yeah, but
But you can do that, no problem with me. Huh? But you shouldn't pretend to be a real journalist in that case.
I didn't say you have to say you're a real journalist if your stuff doesn't sell. I mean, what journalist will choose? I write a good piece, but that doesn't sell, instead of a piece that's
But you think you can't write something that takes these things into account that sells? Is that something that's always supposed to not sell?
completely honest, I don't think.
You have to lie to sell.
No.
No.
It's adapt your writing style and what you write to your audience.
Yeah, your writing style. I haven't said anything about a writing style. You can write.
What you write and how you write it and which persons you interview. Because like if you have a piece with someone known and it will sell more, then you have a piece
Yeah.
with someone less known.
Yes.
But maybe the person less known is more capable of telling.
Yes. Yes. Well, one of the things I'm trying to say here, that is just the task of a real journalist. A real ethical journalist is someone who does not think about selling in the first place. That's one of the aspects. Selling might come as a side effect, you could say, by writing in a certain way, by taking things into account that perhaps putting someone at the first and the title or something like that. You can do all kinds of stuff to sell, but what you do shouldn't be determined by the fact that you can sell it. That doesn't mean you can't have a job trying to write something that sells. That is also something that's not a job, I would say. That's not journalism, that's writing. Pseudo-fiction, like I said. Yes?
I'm not trying to be rude, but I think what you're presenting is really a philosophical topic.
Indeed.
It can be realistic. This can
Why not?
Well, this is impossible.
I can give an example of what I think that is good journalism. I can give an example of that. It is not really a journalistic piece because I haven't had the time in the meantime to look around what is good ethical journalism into what I am telling here in the mainstream journalists. But I have a talk that I would describe as the way a good journalist should talk or write. So I can, if there is time, I can show that. But I would perhaps go through the more practical slides first, and perhaps I don't know how much time I have.
You have about 15 minutes.
Still 50 minutes. The talk is about, I think, 10 minutes. I would like to go through the slides.
Could I just ask a question, going back to what Kenneth is saying and also what Dirk, so you're a real journalist. So what do you think, going to the philosophy aspect of, the ethics we need? We almost have to approach it from philosophy first, get our ethics, and then of course we have to sell our articles. But how do you see that as?
Yeah, but I think the philosophical point is, of course you take it into consideration, but you're not writing and thinking about philosophical objectivity. It's just something very practical, and I think most journalists now know that if you take one point of view, then you have to phone someone else to have another point of view. It's just very, very practical.
Yeah.
And
But
you spoke in the beginning about big corporations who the mantra of their objectivity, but that was also political.
Of course.
It wasn't journalists who who said we have to be objective. It was political institutions who said if you talk to a liberal, you have to talk to the socialist as well,
Mhm.
for instance.
But objectivity has been for a long time the core of what real journalism should do, and that's
It's
what
something you strive for. It's not.
yeah, indeed.
It's not. It's not. You never can tell this article is
Mhm.
100% objectivity.
Indeed.
So
But in my proposition, I'm supposing objectivity is perhaps not the right term. Is perhaps not the right ethics. Not subjectivity neither. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to give an American perspective on this. I speak for all Americans. There's a couple of things that occur to me. First, objectivity is, it's not, it doesn't exist in journalism in any genuine sense. I mean, while the term is used, it doesn't really describe anything that's objective. To say that I'll talk to a Republican or a Democrat, to the left, the right, I mean, that's not objective, that's talking to two people. You know, and balancing their opinions. If you take, the way I always express it to my students back home is, you take a half-truth and you take another half-truth and you put them together, you don't get a whole truth. You have two half-truths. It's still, you still have you know, it's still possible that reality or facts or accuracy has eluded you. You just don't come across truth, reality, facts by talking to people. It's not an authentic, valid way to uncover what's going on. I mean, it's certainly one component, but it's not exhaustive. And so while we use the term objectivity, it's really describing not objectivity, it's describing a professional news gathering process, which is totally different. We call it objective, and there are all kinds of, as being suggested, there are all kinds of economic reasons, at least in the United States, why we say something's objective. We say it's objective because then it's credible. And if it's credible, you want to buy it. And you want to buy it because you can put faith in it. And it's faith that, and that faith in the information you're given, quote, objective information, you can act upon. So, I mean, there's a reason for it. Journalism in America, when it first began, was highly partisan, meaning that it was sponsored by political parties. And there was no objectivity wasn't a concept. I mean, objectivity in American journalism really emerges in about the 1920s, and it's not even mentioned in the Journalism Code of Ethics of the Society of Professionals. The term is not used. They use fairness. They use neutrality. Fairness is about as close as journalism in America gets to the concept of objectivity in practice. But partisan journalism meant that you only talked to people who were already on your side. So if you wanted to create a mass audience for mass publications, you had to generalize, and you generalized your tone by abandoning partisanship and adopting something that mimicked objectivity, scientific kind of language, factual language, efficient language. That's really where the journalistic style comes from. Doesn't really, Lisa says I practiced it, taught it, and have experienced it. It's a way to describe what we do, our approach to fact gathering and fact processing and fact publication, but they're not facts. They're not scientific facts, they're not mathematical facts, they're not philosophical facts, they're journalistic facts.
Okay, we can
Fact.
discuss this further later.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot
And I
to
think
be.
in Western Europe it's not very different. And I think the term objectivity is more used by readers than by journalists. And readers who don't like something or viewers who don't like something, they say that's not objective.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's more used by readers and by the public than by journalists, I think.
So you're saying it's no longer important.
No,
I didn't say
It
There's
isn't.
a wrong definition of
But,
objectivity here. There's 4 different definitions.
Yeah,
of
yeah.
words.
Yeah.
Kenneth has a different opinion about objectivity than yours. I think maybe it's good to explain that
Yeah.
objectivity is more than just not using the words me, mine, and I. Because that sometimes people think, oh, don't use the words
Right.
I or my opinion is. It's much further, it goes much further, it's an attitude. So maybe, can you say in one sense what objectivity is?
Describing matters of fact and not opinions. That is the normal definition of objectivity.
But objectivity in law is different than objectivity in science, which is different than objectivity in journalism.
Well, it's very related. The objectivity in journalism
The
is.
methods of going about discovering what is different.
Uh-huh.
In the courtroom, you swear people in.
Yeah.
They have an adversarial relation, you know, adversarial argument, the jury makes a judgment on it. That's, when we go out and cover stories, I don't get to swear anyone in.
Yeah.
And so they can lie to me all they want.
Okay, so another question. How important is philosophy in thinking about journalism and in thinking about ethics? But you don't have to answer that now, but it certainly goes into the thought process, I think. But I give the floor back to you. It's your
Well,
presentation.
in all the what I wanted to describe, it's all about ethics, and ethics you can describe that in different senses too. You have practical ethics. How do I do that to conform to the rules in my profession, for example? That's a kind of ethics, but I wouldn't call that real ethics from a philosophical standpoint. In any case, not. Ethics has to do with values. What do you value? What is important for you? What guides you in your search to whatever is true, for example, or something like that? And how does that play a role in what you do? So what is important about ethics, ethics I mean, is that you explicitly show what is important for you, and that choice, the choices you make, determine what you do, and that this is not something that is in the background and that you do as if there is nothing. That is the whole story about why ethics and philosophy, for that matter, that's the same thing, matters. You should make explicit what is implicit and what is not clear, to make clear for everyone who is reading you or who is following your stories that what you stand for is clear and how it influences it. And it has all kinds of practical things that I could, but I probably have not much time left.
5 more minutes and then at the end.
Well, I will go through the practical slides. I won't take long. I just one more question.
No, it's not really a question.
Okay.
You say that that when people read your stories, they have to be able to understand what you stand for, but then doesn't objectivity disappear?
Yeah, indeed. That's what I'm saying. That's my story. Objectivity isn't everything. And if you use the term objectivity, it's often a way of hiding what is really going on. That's the whole story that I was telling. Yeah?
I think I agree.
So we all agree.
Okay.
I agree, but it's different.
Okay. I hope so. I hope so. Okay, so go real fast through what I have tried to put as practical consequences of the things I suggest. So I mentioned a few guidelines you could use as an ethical journalist in my book. One of the things, the most important thing is that the image of Socrates is a good image for a journalist. And how does Socrates go about his life? Well, he doesn't pretend to know a lot. He tries to show what the others that think they know a lot, what they have as presuppositions. So a journalist just has to do about the same thing, posing questions to people and trying to determine what makes them, drives them, what makes them work. So one of the important aspects to be able to do that is the first thing, that is know thyself. It's a very well-known Socratean expression. And that is something that is very important, I think, for a journalist. The first aspect that is very important. And that has to do with very normal things like psychology, sociology, where do you come from, what is your personality, and so on. You should know that as a journalist, because these things influence the way you work. And if you don't know that these things influence the way you work, you are working in the dark, you could say. Because the things you will put forward will be colored by this psychology, this culture you come from, this social background you come from. So that's the first aspect, know thyself. And knowing thyself has everything to do with things like how do you gain energy, how do you gather information, how do you make decisions, and how do you go about your lifestyle. These things come from standardized psychological tests, the Myers-Briggs or Jungian variant, and is a very good way to see how you function in life. I think it should be a prerequisite for every journalist to know himself in that aspect, at least. There are also other techniques you could complement with that. Some kind of a psychoanalysis, but not really in the sense of the old on the couch kind of psychoanalysis, but a bit of a storytelling about your past. It could be a good way to determine what you are dragging with you, what is determining all the things you do. So that could be a good way to go about. Also, you should also talk to other people, be open for critique, do dialogues to see if what you think you are, how you think you function, if that fits. And certainly what also can be very useful in that context is a kind of diary or a blog to see how you decided that at that moment. If you as a journalist know how you function in the past, you can use that to know better what you will do in the future in the same kind of contexts. So that's the first thing, know thyself. The second thing is, no, you are not all-knowing. That is probably the most important Socratean aspect. You know that you study your subjects normally. You study the things you will do research about. But even if you study these things, you must realize you're not the specialist. The specialists are out there. And that is an attitude you should have from the beginning. So distrust every kind of certainty from yourself and from others. That's a main attitude you should have. And then there are all kinds of more aspects, but I will hurry on for... we're in a time also where there are a lot of tools to do research. And you should not overemphasize the specific, which is often the case in a lot of journalism nowadays. You should use data. Of course, that's evident, you could say, but I am reading a lot of stuff that is not using the data correctly. So if you are a journalist, you should familiarize yourself with all the tools that are available to you. Something like Gapminder, I don't know whether you have seen that function. That is a very interesting tool for analyzing data in a visual way. Spreadsheets, of course, using Mathematica. I don't think you use that either, but it's very interesting to visualize big data chunks. Data mining utilities. There are so many tools available that if you use them correctly, you can see a lot more what is happening around you. If you don't use them, you're half blind again. So if you haven't done that already, you should choose some of these tools and learn to know them. So let's go on. Also very important, knowing that you don't know, inform yourself with the people around you. So again, there are other tools than tools for analyzing data. There are also a lot of tools nowadays to connect to other people. So, of course, everybody is using some form of it, but you should be familiar with all the forms there are there. Google+, Twitter, Facebook, of course, Wikipedia, other wikis, and especially all those tools where discussions are going on. And for example, Wikipedia is a very interesting medium to follow the discussions around topics. That is something that is not very often done, but for a journalist, it should be the first practice. If you are researching something, you go to Wikipedia, probably, everyone does. But if you go to Wikipedia, also go to the discussion pages behind that, because there is a lot of information you can use that makes clear where difficulties are in explaining a topic, where strong opinions live, and so on. So you should make yourself familiar with all these things too. So, next mantra is distrust the well-spoken and the powerful, because, of course, they are professionals. And professionals know what they should tell you to make their message only as big as they want it to be. And they are specialized in deceiving you and telling the truth, perhaps, or if you could tell, you call it that, but telling part of the truth. So if you have the well-spoken or the powerful at the other side of the table, be very careful. I suppose you all know that, but it's something that should be made very clear also. It's something that, for example, Socrates was very able in also. He was very able to undermine the opinions and the strong views of very well-known people in his time. That's why he was put to death, of course, at the end of his life. Okay, beware of flattery and so on, that is normal. Well, here I have the example of what I think is good journalism, but it is not a journalist that is talking, it is someone who is talking about the future of democracy in a TED Talk. So a TED Talk is of course not a journalist article, it's also not a documentary or something like that, but the way he does his talk is really as a Socratian or a real, how could I describe it, real journalist with the ethics in my book should do. He does that. I don't know whether there's still time. I think it's about 10 minutes. Otherwise, we do it some time later. Or
yeah,
okay.
Half an hour. If we can do it then, we'll take a break now.
Yeah.
And if we can have the URL.
Yeah. Okay.
Tell
Yeah.
us which talk it is.
Yep.
We don't need to go on.
Okay. I can.
Sorry to rush you.
No problem. I'm almost finished then. Be prepared to risk your life to lay bare the lie. That's of course a very heavy statement, especially from a philosopher who is way back behind. That's very easy, of course. But it has been mentioned in the last talk also. It is very important that you make clear what you are doing with the people you are talking to and with the data you get from the people you are talking to. And you should protect these data and these people as much as possible. So that is something that is very important in current journalism also. Okay. Also here, learn to use the tools that are necessary for your profession. Here in the sense of using anonymization tools, using encryption where needed. You will not always be in contact with people that, that are conforming to authority. And it is not because someone is against authority that he is the wrong person or that you shouldn't contact him. A journalist perhaps also has a task to sometimes take contact with people that are wanted by authorities. So if you are going to do that and if you are using information or spreading information that way, you should know tools how to circumvent eavesdropping. So tools like Tor or tools like encryption of mail and so on, you should be able to use that before you really need them. And something that I should very much recommend that you do that as soon as possible. It's also a fact that it's not because you are in a Western country that there is no eavesdropping. That is not something that is only going on in faraway countries. It's something that is happening here also. And then don't hesitate to act upon your doubts, not your beliefs. It is especially when you are hearing something or not hearing something that you should be aware. Not because you believe in a certain thing, but because there are things being hidden, for example. This is one of the things you should use as the way you can be an ethical journalist. And then we are almost there, I think. That's the last one, but it's in fact the cornerstone of the whole story. You should know and you should determine what matters for you. If you don't do that, then you are playing hide and seek with yourself. You're not being honest with yourself. So you should determine what future you personally want, and you should consider how this future fits with other people. It's not only about your own future, of course, it's about the future of all the people around you. And if you know that, you know what is guiding you, you know what is important for you and what you should do. And so on, and so on. So, and now I will stop. Okay.